yearly research assignment PhD scholars. They won't apply for IETF.
They do have, in the IRT actually do have travel grants. Yeah. Have you looked at that yet or not? So I'm gonna send you a pointer. It's you, right? There's a couple other related topics related to students and research groups. So I'll send you an email with Drew's contacts and pointers to all of these groups. I can get it in the registration system. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, of course. Okay, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. I mean, for the whole program, 60. Yeah. Yeah, and then, I'm sorry, 60 people signed up for including lunch all day. Right. And then an additional 10 said that they were coming late for lunch. So we have the potential to have like 70 kids from hovering around 160 kids for 10%. On-site attendance. Very cool. Yeah, very cool. Good. Yeah, and then Harold told me he's here. Giorgio's told me he's here for his company's going to. Yeah, cool. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. That's what we did for the trainings. Yes, I mean. Somebody from wide. Yeah, right. Yeah, that was me. Too determined. Okay, what am I doing? as you heard, like it happened again. Alex figured out what the problem. He knows what it is.
Oh, good.
Yes.
They're very close.
You want to double check that the clicker works for you?
There we go.
Wait, let's go back one.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we're ready to get started with session 6, talking about internet drafts and RFCs. It's that time again. Get out your phones and scan the QR code so we can track your attendance here. Everybody's doing such a great job. All right. I'm going to turn it over to Rich Sauls to lead you through this session. Rich?
Okay. All right. So I'll be this session. Oh, I keep forgetting there's a thing up front there. All right. I came in from Boston. I'm jet lagged and over caffeinated. So if I start to talk too quickly, just sort of, raise your hand or slow down, tell me to slow down or something. If you have a question at any time during this, come to the mic line. So that's how I'll know it's a question versus me talking too fast. That's me, new picture. I've been involved in the IETF for a long time. Uh, Started reading the old privacy enhanced mail drafts. I'm acknowledged in the HTTP 1.0 spec because I think I did proofreading. I wrote some Usenet software. I've been focusing the past 10, 15 years on security. I tell people not in the technical community that I focus on the S in HTTPS, which is a good way to describe it. And all of that stuff, that entails a whole lot of other things. So the note well, this is a reminder of the note well. You agreed to follow the procedures. This is a reminder of what it is. We don't expect you to read it now or read all the other RFCs. Every meeting at the IETF will start with this reminder. It's something you agreed to when you registered for this meeting. By Tuesday, Wednesday, or even, well, certainly by Thursday or Friday, people will just go, this is a note well, you've all seen it before, and they'll go through it like this. So, okay. So I'm here to talk about documents, which is really, in the rough sense, what the IETF does. We produce things called RFCs. The name comes from the very beginning of the IETF history, where a bunch of grad students working on a project sponsored by the US Department of Defense said, oh, we want to write this stuff down so our program managers can read it and see if it's okay. And so in a moment of modesty, they called it a request for comments. We like to use the RFC acronym in a number of other areas. So tonight there is a request for conversation. Sometimes people call this request for compliance. It's not formally labeled as standard. We're not a standards body, as you've probably heard. But we produce documents that say, if you're going to do this kind of thing, this is the way to do it. ID, I-D, but it's called IDs, is an abbreviation for internet drafts. And so the process of preparing RFCs, you do a bunch of drafts and however many it takes for the working group to agree. Then it goes to the IESG. They were one of those colored blocks in the previous session. Then it goes to the whole IETF community to look at. There might be, 4 drafts within the committee and then 4 other drafts as the various larger and larger groups get to look at it. And then it gets published as an RFC. Alice Russo, there in the blue, will be giving this session in the future, probably. So if you don't like what I'm saying, she'll say it much better next year. Okay, So the basics. Um, we have about 10,000 published RFCs. It's like 9,000 and change. Um, we're, we're we have our own Y2K problem in that we're fixing everything to make sure that we can publish 5-digit RFCs. It'll be a number of years before we get to the 100,000 mark. But anyhow, the authoritative site is www.rfc-editor.org. That's the official publication site. Now, if you go to a web search engine, Google, Bing, what have you, one of the LLMs, and you type into the search bar of your browser RFC 6525 to pick some number at random, you'll probably not get directed to that site. You'll get directed to the data tracker, which we'll talk about or have talked about. Um, that's not authoritative. The authoritative site is there. So sometimes it's often good to have a browser shortcut that points to that and so on. RFCs are published in a variety of formats. If you look at some of the early RFCs, it looks like the old Unix NROF formatter printed on teletype paper, 66 characters per line, 72 lines per page. No, the other way around. But anyhow, it looks like it looks like old line printer printouts because they were. That's all we printed. Over time, we've added PDF formats. Sometimes the PDF looks like the line printer. Sometimes it looks like real HTML. And then there's HTML, RFC, and then the formal HTML and PDF. We go through all sorts of internal gyrations within us to try to figure out, well, which is the official format, which is the presentation format. Can you change this? Can you not change this? Do we have to regenerate everything every single time we add a new element to the official XML? It's it's like angels on the pin. You don't. It doesn't matter too much unless you're really into publication process. Um, but this being the computer field, there are lots of people who are really into all sorts of things. Um, RFCs have a structure. The formal the official publication, the official document format for RFCs is a dialect of XML. So it's got the angle brackets and all the semantic markup in it. And then they get converted with various tools to the different outputs. Um, they have a formal structure and layout. We'll talk about that in a bit. That has a status. I'll also talk about that a bit. There are two sub-series within the RFCs. There's called the STD, which is the standards. And so that covers things like this is the definition of what TCP is. This is the definition of what HTTP is. This is the definition of the FTP protocol. In other words, a standard could be something that's not really used anymore, but it's an official standard. Then there's another sub-series called BCP, where the whole point is you can any problem in computer science can be solved by a layer of indirection. So for example, a document that says, here is the way the IETF works, BCP 10. That points to RFC 2026. If later on that gets revised, the number BCP 10 says we just changed the pointer. So the two subseries, STD and BCP, are indirections to what the actual RFCs are at any given time. A BCP can have multiple RFCs. So if you look at anything, it says any RFC document, it says we use the formal language definition of RFC 2119. Sorry, I know these numbers. Modified by something else, which says may, must, should. They only matter if it's in all uppercase. So that's an example of a BCP that has grown by adding other things. Those standards are only in one of the streams. A stream is a stream is an organization or part of the IETF that can publish RFCs. The common one is the IETF stream. That's published by working groups, approved by the ISG, and reviewed by the whole IETF community. There's the IRTF stream, which is the research groups will publish something. They have slightly different criteria than an RFC, IETF RFC. There's the independent stream editor, ISE, where You get something and it's like, well, no, it doesn't make sense to create a working group out of this. It doesn't fit anywhere else. We will just publish it on that as an independent. It has no standards, no standing in the standards process, and so on. An RFC can update or obsolete other ones. So, for example, when TLS 1.3 came out, it made obsolete TLS 1.2. And so, if you look at or if you look at some other specs, you'll see at the upper left-hand corner what things it updates or obsoletes, and if it's something that's been obsoleted, for example, HTTP 1.0, if you say it'll say updated, obsoleted by there's a new RFC. Well, that you go to that one and it says HTTP 1.1. No, that's updated and obsoleted by HTTP 3 and so on. RFCs are immutable, which means, technical term means they don't change. Once an RFC is published, we're never going to touch it again, except maybe the output format might tweak. Maybe we'll do something like update or add more information to a published author's address. That's currently an argument that's happening within the publications group now. Um, if there's an error, somebody can report an errata. Um, there's a whole errata system for I think for example, within the security area, we have about 300 errata currently reported. Some of them will be fixed next time a document is revised and a new document is published. Some of them will just sit there forever because, oh, I found a bug in the old DNS, the old pre-domain naming system when everything was .arpa.info and so on. Nobody cares about that anymore. So sometimes the router will just sit there. Sometimes they'll be merged into future publications. Mm, Thought I hit next to my.
Is it not?
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Okay. Internet drafts, IDs, the basics. There are about 40,000 RFC internet drafts, IDs. Um, they used to expire after 3 months, 4 months. We don't expire them anymore. Discs got cheap. We keep them. I used to think 40,000 was a lot. I said, oh, how big is Wikipedia? Well, they measure in the millions, so it's not really a lot. Um, the authoritative site, the RFC editor holds the RFCs. The data tracker site holds all of the internet drafts. Now, sometimes if you look at an old draft, it will say, oh, this is expired, but here, and then they'll give you pointers to the content. Um, Drafts can be submitted in a couple of different ways. Plain text, that's for really, really old timers who have still want to be able to run nroff, I guess. Or XML. From either one of those, we will generate the publication formats. Like the RFCs, they have pretty much the same requirements for layouts, uh, sections that are required, and so on. There's an additional section in the draft which says, for example, this is a draft, not an RFC. Be careful, it may change. Um, IDs can only also IDs, whereas before we would talk about whether it's a standard or a common practice or just an informational kind of thing. In a draft, it only says what the intended status is. It's up to the working group, the ISG, and the general IETF community to approve that. So I can say, here is a new standard for Rich Saul's method of encryption. Um, that's unlikely to be a standard. It might be informational, more likely to be experimental, but the ID can claim what it wants to do. IDs, internet drafts, are expected to change. They have version numbers. They have official names, which I think we'll talk about in a bit. Um, so when you make an edit to a draft, um, if it was called draft IETF DNS 2, and then you make some changes and you submit a new version, you will call that draft DNS or draft IETF DNS operations -3. Um, so drafts, like published RFCs, are immutable. Part of that is so we can look back at the history and see what's changed. There's a built-in tool that will run a diff between two different versions. That's often very important, especially as you're getting toward the end of the editing and publication process. You need to run a diff to see what changed. That can be done by anybody. All of these documents are public. Anybody can submit a draft. There's no, again, it doesn't mean anything. There's an interesting, I think we'll talk about Warren Kumari's "This is not a draft" thing, like the "This is not a pipe" picture. Um, they time out and then they're moved to an archive, but they're still widely available. Uh, so useful for history, or it's kind of spelunking archaeology. But generally, people are only thinking about the latest draft and changes from the last version. By the way, that's often what happens at working group meetings here at the IETF during when we meet during the week. People will come up and they will say, okay, here's what changed since the last version at the last meeting. You're expected to, you'll get the most out of the meeting if you understand what the old draft was, and then here's the old draft and then here's the diff. You can't really understand the diff unless you understand the old draft. Then they'll say, here's the open issues we have. We'll talk about those issues. And then those issues will become what changed for the next meeting and so on. It's a common way working groups work, and also on the mailing list or having interim meetings. Okay, document formats. So plain text. They were originally produced on typewriters or line printers connected to old Unix machines. Um, the plain text format looks very much like that. This is the very first request for comments, first RFC. Um, Fit on a standard line printer page, 72 characters, 66 lines. Okay, right. Um, and here it is, a guy named Steve Crocker. You might still bump into him in the hallways. He still attends the meetings. But this shows when it, when the internet when the ARPANET sort of first got started. This was talking about the software that ran on the host. They made a very important distinction between the host and the gateway and so on. They were called imps. Um, but that's what they look like. Um, for a sense of history and purpose, the text format looks similar to this. Some things may no longer be in each of the upper corners, but yeah, it looks the same. The limitation of this is you can't change the metadata, as in who authored it, the date it was published, and so on. If you wanted to put in a diagram, all you could do was sit there and type rows of X's on your screen to make ASCII art, which is even more crude than sort of 8-bit pixel art these days. The links are just links. First of all, didn't exist at the time, but links are shown as annotations. So it'll say you should go to the website, and then in parentheses it will say www.archive.org or whatever it is. Um, but yeah, they, they're not. There's no links. You can't. There's nothing really underlined on your browser to click. The line width is fixed. Reading it on a mobile device, you don't want to do that. And it doesn't indicate, for example, up in the upper left-hand corner, it doesn't say, oh yeah, we have filed errata against these things, or it's been updated by someone. So the plain text, nobody should use it unless you, again, have a source of history or delving into the history of the IETF as an organization. HTML. So in 2019, we learned of this thing called the web. I'm being sarcastic because the IETF helped create the web and define the protocols for it. This is the best way to read an RFC. It's available on any device. It's responsive, sizing, scaling. You can blow up parts. There is a language or a sublanguage called SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, for embedding nice pictures. Most RFCs tend to not have many pictures because most of the people writing RFCs are authors and they think about words, and then maybe they'll sketch out a block diagram, somewhere else. There's a header at the top. You can see it there. That's the gray part that shows, oh, here's where it came from. Here's the things that have updated it. I happen to write this RFC. So here is, the things that it updates and so on. Those can be changed dynamically. More importantly, if somebody else come up with a new version of this, then the metadata at the top will say, oh, this has now been obsoleted by, and then point to the new RFC. All of this information is found through the rfceditor.org website. So it's really the place you want to go to for RFCs. Before June, before this RFC came out, We had what we call HTMLized. Um, worth describing, since you'll see that word on the data tracker. HTMLized just takes the text, plain text format, and wraps it in pre-headers and makes it available so your browser can read it reasonably. Well, not pre-headers, but it's really, it's dumb, it's ugly, and it doesn't scale. It doesn't have all of the other metadata easily available. It's got a few links there on top pointing to the RFC home, the other different formats, and so on. The data tracker does provide HTMLized RFCs generally these days. Sorry, internet drafts these days are generally written using a markup tooling that will automatically generate HTML, proper HTML, proper PDF, and so on. So you don't have to, HTMLized is a transition thing that's kind of dying. RFC XML. This is the formal official definition of what an RFC is. Um, it's the authoritative format. It's not for reading. Um, I worked at an XML company. I don't write an XML. Nobody writes an XML. Um, it's like, you know, that's why we, never mind, I can't think of a joke. But you can see that, for example, all of the metadata there top, here's a link to the data tracker page. Then there you see the title marked up and so on. You can get this information available. It's most useful if you are updating an old RFC and you don't have other formats available, such as Markdown, which we'll talk about. But there it is. It's the thing. It's the source from which all of the other display formats are generated. Okay. Oh, you're just looking. Okay. Um, thought you was leaning over to tell me something. Um, okay. So an RFC has a status, and these are a couple of these are the list of statuses. Informational. Um, here's something that we think, we being the IETF community, think is useful to the whole internet or the technical internet community. It's not a standard. It doesn't have consensus or recommendation. Um, yeah, for example, well, no, it's not a good example. A BCP, for example, it says how the IETF picks the places where it meets. That could be an informational document. It'll be marked as a current best practice, but it's not a standard in terms of protocols. Experimental. Here is a new version of TCP, or here's a new version of IPv6 that we'll call IPv7. We're not really recommending it yet, but it's, let's try it out. Proposed standard is, okay, this is going to be the new version of TLS. Figure out what the name is, but it's the proposed standard. After some number of years, it can get presented to the ISG and say, we should make this a standard, an internet standard. And that's the final stage. We used to have something called a draft standard, which was a formal way of saying, this is almost done, but not quite ready yet. Now we just go proposed. After it's been in use for a bit of time, we now say, okay, it's a full standard. Other groups, a BCP, they have two roles. One is to talk about them as the subseries, but then there are individual documents that can be called BCPs. It's well, I'm not going to read the words here, but it's documents the IETF processes, and the other part is it explains things about the whole internet and the way it should be. For example, the DNS group has an operations group, which says operations working group that says, here's how you should organize your DNS entries, and here's how you should refer to subdomains and things like that. That's a BCP document. Historic is something where it gets marked. For example, we have published this RFC on HTTP 1.0. We say, nope, that's now historic, and it gets marked as such. It's obsolete. It may not be obsoleted by a particular thing, but it's like not of general use anymore unless you're building a time machine to go back. Then finally, there is unknown. Before those classes and statuses were created, there were a lot of RFCs, 1,127, that we don't know what their status is, and we're not going to go back in time, and it's not worth trying to actually figure out. So we just mark them unknown. Subseries. So if it's an internet standard or a proposed standard, it's in the STD series. If it's got a BCP in it, um, that is means it's part. If it's in the BCP track or it's part of the IETF processes, it's in the BCP series. Separate numbering, and one RFC can be in. Sorry, an RFC, a BCP or an STD can have multiple RFCs. So this is best current practice BCP 226. And if you look at it, it expands to three. And um, the thing is, if something changes, if one of these like 9137 gets updated by RFC number 9992, then BCP 226 stays the same. All of the documents that referred to stay the same, but the contents of 226 become, 9137 is gone, 9992 is now there. Again, it's the level of interaction fixes many problems. Streams are the group that is a way of grouping what the source of RFCs was or is. IETF stream, the largest, the most important, the thing that defines the protocols um, that make the internet run better, make the internet work better. The IAB, you saw their organization on that chart. They publish a lot of streams. For example, they run workshops that say, how can we do encrypt? How do we address the conflict between network encryption and network management? So the management of I forget what it is, a MARNU, there'll be a IAB document, IAB RFC on that workshop. Or they had one on the centralization of the internet and how can we work to keep it decentralized? That would be another example. The IRTF stream publishes, you can think of them as research reports or analysis of scope of what's going on. Editorial stream, newly created, that's a stream devoted to the RFC series itself, describing the publication formats, the XML input language, and so on. Outside of all of those is the independent submission stream. We have an editor, Elliot Lear, just recently became the ISE editor, and they publish things that are outside all of the above. The one I remember most recently, a recent one I remember is the GNU naming system, GNS, was published as an ISE document. So it's kind of a competitor to DNS, didn't really work in anywhere fit into the IETF, so it was published as an independent document. All right, so let me talk about the structure now that we've discussed the organization. An unadopted internet draft and an RFC have many things in common. The title, the authors and editors. There's generally not a real distinction between author and editor. You can have sort of up to 5 authors. Beyond that, it's like, okay, let's figure, you shouldn't have more than 5. And if you have 10 people, it's not like a paper where everybody gets, credit for getting their name in a journal publication. It just doesn't work. So the area director of the working group and the RFC Publication Center will push back if there's more than 5. So authors or editors, sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. When it was published, the intended status or what the status actually is. So you see at the top there, it says it updates, what it updates, and then it says in parentheses, if approved, the intended status, whereas on the lower one, which is an actual RFC, it says what the category is. So there's one difference. The working group, if it's intended or if it's documented, the stream, that doesn't matter. If it's been adopted by a working group or the ISE or the IAB, the stream is known and it's mentioned. We also publish, international standard serial numbers and document object identifier information. Those appear in all of the published RFCs for the librarians among us. The name, let me mention a little bit about the name. So you see at the top line or the it's wrapped, but the third line that says draft Tojins DCP options contact considerations dash oh 01. So every draft starts with the word draft. If it's not part of a working group, then typically the next thing will be the login name or the last name of the author. Then the next, so Tojins, um, Tommy, Just I, and not sure where the name came from. Um, the next part is the working group, so that would be DHCP. And then a short name for what the draft is about, option concat considerations. And you can see that there's a more English version of the name with proper capitalization in the document. And then dash oh 01, that's the first version. Actually, the first version is dash oh 00 because we're zero origined, but then shortly thereafter, there'll be a dash oh 01. If the authors make changes to this, then they'll publish a new version and it will say draft dash oh 02. If the DHCP working group adopts the document, then the name becomes draft IETF. You know, if we ever get an Isidore Edward something, you know, we'll have a problem if somebody has the initials IETF as their name, but it'll say draft IETF DHCP and then the same thing. So again, it's the draft IETF and then the working group and then the short name. A lot of the tooling available will help do this automatically. Many sections are standard boilerplate automatically documented. So here's the one for an internet draft. It says this is, you know, or here's the one for an informational document, where it came from. Internet drafts have the same thing. Status of this memo, because they're just still called memos. um, it says, you know, this is an internet draft. They should not be quoted as and referenced as a standard in any other place. The copyright notice. One of the entities associated with the IETF is the IETF Trust. Just recently moved corporate homes and changed its name. They exist to hold the copyrights and they exist to freely give them out to anybody who wants to use them. Some trademarks we hold dearly, such as the IETF logo. Um, the copyrights on the names like TLS, no other standards organization could define something and call it TLS because they'd be violating our copyright. So, and the table of contents is also automatically generated. It didn't used to be. People used to actually have to type 6.1, 6. 6.2, 6.3, and then if they made an error, added a new, they'd have to go back and retype all of that information. So, computers can be wonderful. Required content. Every document has to have these things. Every RFC ultimately has to have one of these things. Abstract, short, concise, comprehensive overview of what the document is, why we're doing it, what it does. No details at all. It's a summary for it. There's mailing lists, and we publish whenever a new RFC comes out. The Publication Center puts out something on Mastodon, the Fediverse. Probably, I don't know if they still do Twitter or not. Yeah, you still do Twitter. Okay. Don't. Um, sorry. Um, Introduction, more detail than the abstract. Typically, the abstract will be the first paragraph of the introduction, and then there'll be some more detail and motivation. That will also be where you say, and here's the terminology I'm using, or here's the definitions of terms. Security considerations, if there are any. Sometimes it may just be there are no security considerations because, for example, we're defining how the IETF picks where to meet. IANA considerations, Leslie mentioned protocol registries. It's a summary of what you're asking the organization, the name, internet naming authority to create. Things like TCP options or HTTP headers or DNS records or anything that's got a set of spaces where you can put in variables. That's a registry, and so those will be summarized in the IANA considerations. There's also privacy considerations that appear in some. It's optional. References. One place you can divide references into informational and normative. Normative is like that document makes, you need to understand that document to understand this one. You need to understand, quick works on top of IP. Therefore, you need to understand the IP, how IP works. So IP would be an normative reference. Okay, writing an ID. Lots of people come to the IETF because they want to write and get some drafts submitted. Okay, surprising fact. So here's the Warren Kamari. This is not a draft. Um, it's full of nonsense. It's amusing reading maybe the first time, maybe not all of it. But anyhow, it makes the point that if someone happens to find this, it's just a draft. Anybody can write it. You don't need permission from anybody, maybe your employer. But some people write IDs and they don't get submitted. Once an ID is submitted, it's never deleted, withdrawn, except in amazingly unusual circumstances. I think past couple of years we had two because we finally decided they were mean and nasty and weren't didn't reflect well on us. They don't have any formal status. It's just some document. This is like a free library where anybody can drop off a paperback or a newsletter. When you submit a draft, um, you're acknowledging, and the text in there says, I am submitting it according to the right. I'm granting some of my rights to the IETF, in particular, the right to control its publication, to make it freely available, and so on. Okay, this part in blue is wrong. Alice and I both agree on this. If you are skilled in XML and have a good validating lifestyle, consider your life choices. Go with Markdown, which is a very simple structure, like sections start with a pound sign at the beginning, a subsection starts with 2 pound signs, and so on. We have all of these tools available because we have people who've been growing up and helped invent XML, for example. They now chair working groups, so they probably write in XML, or dream in it. Authors.ietf.org, that has all pointers to all of these tools. The thing you want to take away from this slide is write in Markdown, and in particular use the template tools that are available or pointed to by these links. Add your content. There are required content. Many of the tools, such as the ID template that I mentioned and the other Markdown templates, will have the sections where it says, dash, 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 your content here, your content here, your content here. BCP format is the BCP 14, describes the use of the keywords must, should, must not. There was a pretty funny, still is, RFC about April Fool's Day RFC that made fun of these things, which added terms like probably shouldn't, we'll say no, but we know you will anyway, those kinds of things. The ISG has guidance on inclusive language. The point being, inclusive language removes ambiguity and makes it easier for everyone to understand. If you use abbreviations or special terms, they get called out in the introduction. There's diagrams. You can use SVG. There's formal languages. Things like ABNF, BNF format for describing what headers and things look like. So that's used for text. There's Yang, which is used for network protocols. And there's also little protocol block diagrams, which say, here's how the bytes on the wire are laid out. All of those things can be fit into the RC format. Author tools, which is separate from authors, has validation tools. It says, it gives you ways to upload your document and validate that it meets all the requirements. Generally, you're probably not going to write your first draft all by yourself. You'll probably work with some other co-author, and hopefully they've got a little more experience and can follow the lead. The IAB is hosting a desk all week, I think, about how to bring new work to the IETF. They might be able to give you pointers, and you already know where I stand. Use the ID template and Markdown. But anyhow, it will validate, and the author tools is used for, as I said, validating, checking that all of the nits are gone, and things like that. submit your draft. So data tracker again, and let me just see. Yeah. So the yellow line up there at the top. Um, by submitting your draft, you are granting these certain rights to the IETF, to the LLC through its trust. You're not transferring the rights, you're just granting them. So if you publish a document and you submit it as a draft, you can then take your document and do anything you want. You can shop it to another standards organization. You can get it published in a technical journal. You can do anything you want with it. It doesn't affect your rights, but you can't stop the IETF from progressing it and advancing it and changing it as it wants to. So you're giving them a copy that has gives them copyright control and redistribution control. Occasionally, every couple of years, someone gets hung up on that and they say, "Oh, I want to undo my draft because I've got valuable intellectual property in there." Um, doesn't happen. Authors.ietf has a whole bunch of resources. Fully catalog all the tools. We've developed some. As mentioned in the previous slide, a lot of the IETF infrastructure and tooling is maintained by developers. So there's a thing called the code sprint you might have seen in the agenda that meets on Saturday. That's where the data tracker is developed. I go up and fix a typo. That's about all I can contribute to the data tracker. Um, there's people who create whole templates and processes for writing your drafts on GitHub so that all you have to do is say make publish and a GitHub action will take that draft, format it, create a page that shows what changed, and then send it to the data tracker for updating. And you'll get an email that says, click here if you want to publish. So it's pretty easy. The stuff can be pretty well automated. Auth 48. Um, it used to be 48 stood for 48 hours. It's now days, weeks, months. This is the process where the production center, the RFC production center, RPC, I have a different thinking. I always think differently of RPC, right? Because there's only so many acronyms that are available. They take that at that point, they now sort of own the authoritative source, the XML. They'll assign it an RFC number, and so you'll get this mail, which can be really exciting the first time you get them saying, dear author of 2B RFC 9252. It's wow, I'm about to be published. They will have a bunch of questions. These people have forgotten more about grammar and proofreading than I ever knew. And they'll come back and say, we think this, is this what you meant? We think this reads better. That's not consistent with this. And you'll get a whole bunch of questions. You and your co-authors have to answer them. And they make your document better. Um, if you've done any kind of publications and you've worked with an editor, they make your document better at the end. It hurts to see your words being changed, but it's worth it. They will check all your references. They will clarify and reformat text. They'll say, oh, this diagram doesn't look quite right and doesn't match the text. This caption is just a sentence fragment. How about can we change it to this? And they ask for permission and they say, here's what we want to do. And you can go back. There's lots of email back and forth. I did a document that ended up having significant changes and significant interactions with the registry people, because it was a document about registries, and the RPC and the area director. And ultimately we got something that was really good, but it was kind of frustrating for a while. So it can be. Auth 48, people forget, used to mean 48 hours. It doesn't mean that anymore. It means whatever it means. So you've seen this slide 4 times at least before. Happy to take any questions if there are any. Um, okay. Oh.
Hi, this is Prasad from Cisco. I had a couple of questions with regards to expired status of a draft.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why it expires in 6 months?
Sure. So originally, expired was to prevent the working group from getting filled up with things that nobody was working on anymore. Um, there have been proposals over time to stop marking things as expired, but often the authors lose interest, the working group loses interest, and so, um, but often also sometimes people say, "Oh yeah, here's I'm publishing a new version that's exactly the same as the old one, except the version number went from X to X plus one." People do that because you run out of time. It's a volunteer organization for the most part. Very few people get paid to work on the IETF and document and drafts and RCs full time. So life gets in the way and things just expire. Um, Often, if you see something expire, if you look in a data tracker page for a working group and you see a section says expired drafts, contact the author, see if they're still interested. Maybe they moved on to a different responsibility. Contact the the working group chair or chairs more likely, and say, "Hey, I'm interested in picking this up. Do you have any advice?" So it just sometimes it means something, sometimes it doesn't. You just have to ask.
Okay, thank you. I had somebody come up to me yesterday who was interested in a draft which expired 12 years ago.
Hmm.
So there's no time limit, I guess, right? Like if someone
No,
is interested in it, bunch,
yeah,
bunch
no,
of years
no,
later, then there is interest and we can revive it and pick it
yeah,
forward.
right. I mean, if it's 5 years later, or more than, there's probably going to have to be a lot more technology updates since then, of course. But yeah, no, there's no, that's fine. If,
Thank you.
if it's still solving a problem that's of interest or of use to the internet, then there's no reason not to pick it up.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your time. Oh, wait a minute.
Hi, Alice Russo. I just wanted to point out one thing about these slides and what we've just talked about. So a lot of this was about the internet drafts, and then at the very end, Rich talked about Auth 48. And I wanted to point out that that only happens for a very small portion of internet drafts that make it through the approval process for one of the streams that Rich talked about. So for example, if your document went through the working group process and eventually was approved for publication as an RFC, then your document would go to the RFC Production Center and receive that editing service and go to Auth 48 for you to review the edits that have been made to your document. But just because you wrote an internet draft, it's not necessarily going to make it to that step in the process. Just
Yeah,
wanted to point that out.
that's a really good point. And in fact, a draft could well go through a couple of dozen iterations, if ever, before it gets to the point of being published as an RFC. Um, it doesn't mean, and if you get frustrated, you leave and go to the ISE, independent stream. But yes, the draft can be thought of as either individual versions of the draft or the chain of everything that led up to the final point where it's now, we're all done technically. Let's give it over to the publication center to get approved. Good point.
Okay.
Okay.
So thank you, Rich. So you guys are hanging in there. You're doing a great job. We're throwing a lot of information at you. We're almost done here. Our next session, we're going to have a little bit of fun. We're going to have a panel of experienced IETFers that are going to talk about their experience, what worked for them on getting integrated in the IETF, hot topics, and various other fun pieces of information. And so we're just going to do a quick turnover, probably 2 minutes or so. And then we're going to get started. We're going to try to stay on schedule. So if you need a bio break or anything, please do so. And we'll meet you back here in a bit.